Hello and good morning. My name is Alex Lightstone, and for those of you who don't know me, I head up the PeopleSoft Managed Services practice here at Version 1. And I'm here today to talk to you about Ferguson's journey to fully managed PeopleSoft and hosted in the cloud. So as I mentioned, this session is on Ferguson, which is a version one customer, and their journey from on-premises PeopleSoft to fully managed cloud-hosted PeopleSoft. So to start with, I thought I'd give you some background to the project and the work that we did with Ferguson on this, and indeed continues to do so. So, for those of you not familiar with the Ferguson brand, Ferguson is a leading value added distributor of plumbing and heating products, primarily to the trade and principally in North America. To give you an idea of the size of the company, ongoing revenue for the year just ended, July 31st, was around 19.9 billion, of which the trading profit was 1.6 billion. So you can see they're a sizable organization. Ferguson PLC is listed on the London Stock Exchange and is included in the FTSE 100 index of listed companies. So Ferguson are a long-term PeopleSoft financials user. I believe it's at least 15 years that they've been using PeopleSoft financials for. Currently running on PeopleSoft Financials version 9.2 on a very recent image, and prior to this project, they were using PeopleTools version 8.5.6. For the techies amongst us, they run on an Oracle database on Linux with PeopleSoft application servers running on Windows. There is also, or they did have a managed file transfer solution, which was used for managing the various external third-party file-based interfaces, and they also had single sign-on between PeopleSoft and their Active Directory instance. So the background to the actual work that we were doing is that the existing on-premises PeopleSoft servers were due to be decommissioned, and the in-house sort of DBA and PeopleSoft support team would no longer be available. Would no longer be available to work on PeopleSoft as they were being transitioned elsewhere. The US side of the Ferguson business actually they elected to move to Oracle ERP Cloud, obviously the SaaS solution. We won't hold that against them. But the UK and Switzerland offices, very wisely in my opinion, wanted to retain PeopleSoft financials. Now the UK and Switzerland offices aren't that big, so we're talking about a relatively small group of users here, let's say around 50 people. There was a hard deadline that we were working against of the 15th of June this year for the decommissioning of the on-premises servers. So that really defined the timelines for the project. So Ferguson engaged version 1 to find an alternative method for the provision of PeopleSoft and for the hosting of their PeopleSoft financials application. And we, version 1, provided the solution of a fully managed PeopleSoft as a service cloud-hosted instance. So what does that actually mean? Well, what that means is basically Ferguson themselves don't need to do anything other than use the application. We give them a link, they log in, and they use the application, and in the background, version 1 will do all the maintenance, all the ongoing support, and indeed the functional support to the users as well. As I'm sure you know, there are various options out there for hosting applications and so on. Obviously, you have Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, but also Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And that platform was the one that was elected or recommended by version 1 to go with. And that basically provided us, the hosting arrangement there was at the IaaS level, infrastructure as a service level, which basically means that the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure platform is giving us the sort of servers and the associated network infrastructure. we, as in version 1, will then install the Oracle database, install the middleware, and of course the PeopleSoft application. There are other ways of doing it. You can, of course, go for platform as a service, where Oracle would look after the database for you. But we've no need to do that. We have plenty of Oracle database DBAs, so we can manage that part ourselves. For those of you not familiar with the sort of different levels of cloud hosting, I thought it might be useful just to very briefly talk through the different sort of options you have when it comes to cloud hosting. So I've mentioned IaaS, infrastructure as a service. Oh, sorry. I've mentioned platform as a service, or PaaS, and then you have the full-blown software as a service, which would be more like the cloud applications, such as Oracle HCM Cloud, Oracle ERP Cloud, and so on. So if you're using on-premise, then you will be basically managing everything related to your PeopleSoft application. If using infrastructure as a service, well, it says you manage here, but in reality, that's actually we version 1. We version 1 will manage this part, so the applications and the database and so on for you, where the hosting provider will manage the actual sort of server infrastructure and networking and so on. Going to the next level, you have the platform as a service, which is really where we version 1 would just be managing the applications, and the hosting or platform provider would be dealing with everything up to the database and potentially even the middleware. And then you come to the full-blown SaaS model, software as a service, which is where the hosting provider will manage the full application stack. Now, it's worth pointing out that I've said that obviously this is being hosted in Oracle Cloud Infrastructure at the IaaS level, but of course, from Ferguson's perspective, it's actually really at this sort of software as a service level, because version 1 is managing all the layers for them. So in terms of the sort of hardware provision within version 1, within Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, we didn't really see a need to replicate the existing server estate at all. So we had this sort of segregation of the production and the non-production environments. So the production servers are completely separate off in a kind of separate grouping, where the non-production servers all sit together in a separate grouping again. But basically, it was a replication of pretty much of the existing server estate that Ferguson had within their on-premise data center. So in terms of development, we have one Windows application server, one database server, UAT. There were load balanced application servers and a database server. The DR, again, just an application server, and then on the production side, again, similar to the UAT environments, 2 Windows application servers and a Linux database server. And as I mentioned, both the UAT and production servers were or are indeed load balanced. As with any cloud hosting implementation, we spend quite a lot of time working with the customers, in this case Ferguson's IT security people, to assure them of the security of the solution that is being put in. But obviously, one part of the solution, one part of the security aspect is obviously, ensuring that the servers are adequately protected from malicious actors on the public internet. Excuse me. But of course, the other side to security is also ensuring that the data is secure and that we have the ability to recover should there be any catastrophic failure in the production environment. So the disaster recovery database is, or the disaster recovery synchronization, if you like, is managed at the database level using an Oracle product called Oracle Data Guard. That effectively maintains a live link between the Oracle database, the production database, and the DR database. So any change in production will, in near real time, it's generally within a minute or two, have been replicated to the disaster recovery database. We agreed with Ferguson on a recovery time objective of 4 hours. So that basically means we would aim to have the disaster recovery environment back up in 4 hours should there be an issue on production. Of course, 4 hours might seem a long time, and generally we would expect that to occur within a maximum of 1 hour. Similarly, there was a recovery point objective of 15 minutes. So that means that we would aim to restore production to within 15 minutes we would aim to restore production in the disaster recovery environment within 15 minutes of the failure having occurred. But again, as I mentioned, in reality, that recovery point objective would generally be a minute or two, because that's generally the sort of delay that Oracle Data Guard is working to. As an additional security measure, and probably as you would expect, belt and braces. We run nightly backups on the servers, and those are retained for 90 days, just if there was a need to ever go back and restore some data. The servers are all running antivirus software and firewalled from the public internet, so it simply is not possible to reach the servers from the public internet. In fact, the only way to reach the servers is through a VPN connection, which runs from Ferguson to the OCI, to the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure servers, or through a second VPN connection that runs from version 1 to the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And just to be clear, we're not talking about VPNs where the user has to initiate a VPN, as you might do with remote working from home. These are site-to-site VPNs, and effectively, from the user's perspective, it's transparent, and these are, they access it over the Ferguson network as they would access any other server. The servers in Oracle Cloud Infrastructure do, of course, require internet access, primarily for patching. And where that is required, that actually passes through the Ferguson network. So as I mentioned before, the servers have no direct connectivity to the network, to the internet. And when they do require internet access, it will actually go across the VPN through Ferguson's network and then out through Ferguson's internet gateway, which gives Ferguson the added reassurance that they're effectively managing any internet access from those servers. So moving on to the actual implementation and the actual project itself. So the project scope was defined to include the migration of the existing PeopleSoft servers and associated infrastructure to Oracle Cloud. It was effectively, as I mentioned, it was a replication of the existing estate. So it was basically, what you would call a lift and shift. Combined with that, we also agreed to upgrade PeopleTools to version 8.5.7, which at the time was the latest available. It was unfortunate that this was being done just on the cusp of version 8.5.8 becoming available, but at the time we couldn't plan for that, so it had to be 8.5.7. And similarly, we also included a get current process in terms of applying all available patches for the PeopleSoft financials application, bringing that up to image 34, which again was the latest available at the time. Now, as I mentioned at the start, with Ferguson's existing on-premises estate, they had what's called a managed file transfer solution, which is, it's quite an advanced application for managing all the various file transfers needed for third-party file-based interfaces. Given that the PeopleSoft application itself only has, I think it's three external interfaces, implementing a full managed file transfer solution felt to be a bit of overkill. So we needed to come up with a replacement for that. But as I say, implementing replacing that managed file transfer solution for what were three different interfaces just felt like it would have been overkill for what we needed. And I'll talk about that a bit later on. So in terms of the actual project timeline, contract was finalized, I believe, from memory, it was around November 2019. These years are my apologies. And the security workshops actually started in December 2019. So we were really working through the security workshops with IT from December 2019 last year. That process of working through with security, it was quite a lengthy process. In absolute fairness to the IT security team, they were doing their job and basically just making sure that the data was going to be secure and the Ferguson wouldn't be compromised in any way. So the actual build within the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, so that would be the servers and the sort of supporting networking infrastructure, started around February this year. That took a couple of weeks, and then we moved on to the PeopleSoft install and the initial data upload of a copy of the production database. Once PeopleSoft was up and running, that was handed over to the users for testing, which was around April this year. Just at the start of lockdown. Fortunately, obviously, because it's all in the cloud, there was no impact on that. And then the user testing, yeah, that went on for a few weeks. There were a few issues to resolve on our side, and then we eventually went live on the second May Bank holiday weekend, with the system sort of being properly put into operation on the 25th of May this year. So to look in, just to look into a bit more detail as to what happened. So as I mentioned, there were some workshops around the sort of architecture of the Oracle Cloud infrastructure solution. As I mentioned, the main focus was really just to replace the existing server estate in the Oracle Cloud infrastructure. So we were basically just saying, right, you've got these servers now. These are the ones, we're now going to move those into the Oracle Cloud infrastructure. One thing we did do though was to look at some potential cost reductions. So for example, given that Fergusons PeopleSoft environment, as I mentioned, they're a long-standing PeopleSoft user. It's been around for a long time. It's very stable. You don't need your development environment, for example, running 24/7. So some cost reductions were identified for various servers that didn't need to be on 24/7. Similarly, the UAT environment is only available from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday to Friday, and that helps. That's one of the big benefits of cloud hosting, of course, is that you are paying as you go. You are paying based on usage. So if you're not using the servers and you can power them off, then that will provide significant cost reductions. As I mentioned, there were quite a few workshops between Ferguson's sort of IT security team and version 1's OCI teams. Those discussions were mainly technical, and as I mentioned, primarily were centered around sort of the IT security requirements in terms of firewalls, antivirus. There were some other things, SSL certificates used for ensuring any encryption is handled correctly, and also as discussed previously, walking through those disaster recovery requirements. So in terms of the execution of the project, it was actually relatively straightforward. It was actually a very nice, relatively straightforward project. The version 1 OCI team are able to build the kind of servers and associated network infrastructure in Oracle Cloud using scripts. Now, the big benefit of this is that we can actually start work on those scripts far earlier in the project. We don't need to wait for the OCI contracts and commercial agreements to be in place. So the version 1 team were able to start building those scripts fairly early on, and then just tweaking them as we went through with the various requirements from Ferguson's IT security team. This meant that once the OCI contract was in place and we had all the commercial agreements there for the cloud hosting, it was actually very quick just to effectively just run the scripts and let the Oracle Cloud infrastructure build the servers as per the scripted instructions. Off the top of my head, I think the actual sort of pressing the button on the scripts, it was maybe a day, maybe a couple of days to have everything built and in place. Obviously, following that, once the servers were up and running, that was then handed over to sort of the PeopleSoft and Oracle database team to go ahead and install the Oracle database and middleware. Obviously, first on the development server, and then obviously there was an upload of a copy of the production database into PeopleSoft to basically test that install. The uploaded copy of the database upload was actually I believe it was doubly encrypted. So firstly, the actual files to be uploaded were encrypted with PGP, and then the connection was actually was uploaded using a secure FTP connection. So adding that sort of double layer of encryption there, just to make sure the data was safe. I think it was about 7 or 8 hours, I think, initially for the first upload. So 7 or 8 hours later, we had a copy of the database in Oracle Cloud, and we could then finalize the PeopleSoft install. the next steps, as I mentioned, we were also upgrading people tools as part of this, and also applying all available application updates. We then left the servers for, I think it was 4 or 5 days, just as a sort of burn-in period, just to leave everything running and make sure that nothing was going to fall over. The same steps were basically repeated then for the building of the UAT environment, at which point it was obviously passed to the users for testing, and that was eventually signed off. And then obviously we had the, as I mentioned before, we had the actual final move on the 25th of May this year. So in terms of the project outcomes, as I mentioned, yeah, we had the final move to the production servers. We actually started the move on the Friday, ran through to Saturday. Given that the 25th of May was at least a bank holiday in the UK, we had a bit of additional time. The users were tested Sunday. There was a very minor issue related to the load balancing, which we resolved Sunday night, and then the system went live as planned on the Monday. And since then, the system has been stable, and there have been no significant issues. So the challenges with the project were, as I mentioned before, we were working against a very hard deadline for the servers being decommissioned. Initially, we had hoped to be able to start the server build slightly earlier, but as it was in the end, it was February before we could start. So we were up against a relatively tight timeline of around 3 months to really get everything moved up into the cloud, tested and signed off. As I mentioned, one of the ways we mitigated that was by building the sort of server build scripts in advance, so that once everything was in place and agreed, we could literally just push the button. Another challenge that we ran into was that the users had a requirement to be able to upload files onto the PeopleSoft servers for various reasons, generally for sort of some manual interfaces where they had to put the file on the PeopleSoft server, and then the PeopleSoft server would then pick up and process that file. Now they've been doing that through kind of the normal kind of Windows networking shared folders, but unfortunately one of the things we couldn't agree with Ferguson IT Security on was around having that access going to an externally hosted server. So we needed to find a replacement for that Windows, for sort of the Windows shared folder functionality, which obviously wouldn't involve having that sort of Windows integration there. So the solution we came up with, much as we'd done for the initial database uploads, we basically allowed for secure FTP transfers from Ferguson to the PeopleSoft servers. It's slightly different in that the users can't, you're obviously not using the built-in Windows networking anymore, but equally there's a very simple client software that they run and to use to connect and then upload the files. Another issue we ran into during user testing was some significant performance issues when tracing was turned on for batch processes. There are a couple of batch processes that Ferguson run where they would like to have tracing enabled all the time, permanently enabled to facilitate any sort of troubleshooting when there is a problem. And whilst that was running perfectly in the on-prem environment up in the cloud, that was causing some significant performance issues. So after having spent a lot of time troubleshooting that and checking all kinds of things, we had a light bulb moment and realized that the solution was as simple as disabling the antivirus on the specific folder where the trace files were saved. And it turned out that because of the way PeopleSoft writes the trace files, that was causing the antivirus to go crazy and actually slow down the whole server. After excluding the tracing the tracing output folder from the antivirus, suddenly everything ran fantastically well. Another area was single sign-on integration. So we had originally planned for the PeopleSoft applications to continue with the Active Directory integration that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. Again, we couldn't reach an agreement on that, so that hasn't been implemented. Given it's a relatively small group of users in this instance, we're just managing that now through the use of, through the use of internal PeopleSoft passwords. It's something that may be considered for a future project phase, but not currently on the roadmap. And finally, as I mentioned before, we had the file transfer, managed file transfer solution to replace, to have connections to various third-party providers to pick up and receive files. Now, as I mentioned, the managed file transfer solution was overkill for the three interfaces that we'd be running out of PeopleSoft. So in the end, it was decided that we would simply replace that, and by having PeopleSoft connect directly to those third-party providers and retrieve the files itself direct from the PeopleSoft servers, which appears to be working well. Obviously, in the previous context where it was all on-prem and it wasn't just PeopleSoft using that managed file transfer solution, PeopleSoft was one of many applications using it. It made sense to use that managed file transfer solution. But given that once sort of separating away from that, and we just had the three interfaces, that no longer felt appropriate. So we built some scripts within on the PeopleSoft servers, and those are called by PeopleSoft to retrieve the files. So I hope that's given you a flavour of the journey that Ferguson had from on-prem to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. Thank you for listening today. I will stop the presentation now and move on to any questions that may have been asked whilst I've been talking. So just bear with me a moment, and I will switch to the questions. Okay, so there's two questions there, so I'll go through these in the order that they have been voted. So first question is, how do I decide if moving our PeopleSoft system to cloud infrastructure is best for me? My response to that is really, I think the question would be, why wouldn't it be best for you? And unless you've made a big recent investment in a big on-premises data center, I personally don't really think there is a reason not to. Maybe the business you're in is maybe the business you're in is very, the data is very sensitive, and you need to have that big on-site data center, and you need to have all that data on site. But really, there are so many benefits to hosting in the cloud infrastructure, in terms of certainly financially, but also in terms of stability, and the fact that, as Robin mentioned during his keynote, the hardware just is not your concern anymore. The hardware is just managed by well, in this case, by Oracle, and any upgrades that are needed and so on will just happen in the background, and you won't even be aware of them. There's a lot more resilience, and as I say, you can also reduce the costs, because if you're not using a server, then you can just power it off. Where you have an on-premises data center, you may as well keep that server powered on 24/7, because it's going to cost you the same pretty much whether it's on or off. But with the cloud, due to that pay-as-you-go sort of usage model, savings you can absolutely make savings by powering those servers off. So I think on the kind of Oracle HCM ERP cloud application stream, there is one of the sessions there was basically saying, if it's not for you, why isn't it for you? And if not now, then when? And that's exactly what I would say in response to the question of how do I decide if moving our PeopleSoft system to cloud infrastructure is best for me? I would just say, well, why wouldn't it be the best thing? And then let's talk about that, and let's see if we can overcome any reasons you might have. There's another question as well. How large was the production database? That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. I think it was around 600 or 700 gigabytes, but I may be wrong on that. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. I'd have to check my notes. that was asked by Dan, and if you're the Dan that I think you are, then I'll come back to you separately on that. But yeah, so that took around 7 or 8 hours to upload. I think we were able to reduce that upload time for the production move by using various techniques to shrink the size of the database file and so on.